Thanks very much for the intro. It's an absolute pleasure to be back at Vogue Codes 2022. When I last joined, it was in November 2020, and Vogue Codes was an entirely virtual event, and we were in the midst of the COVID pandemic. It feels incredible to be here in person and celebrating such amazing women in STEM that Australia has produced, and with such great energy. So I'm loving being here. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Manuri. I'm the CEO and founder of HealthMatch. I'm 5/6 of a doctor after dropping out of med school in my final year to start HealthMatch. And I'm really hoping at this point that I've convinced my mum that it was the right decision and it was okay to defer. I never had plans to start a business or become an entrepreneur, and it was quite the opposite. Growing up, I was obsessed with becoming a neurosurgeon. And when I was 10, I read a biography about a particular neurosurgeon who was leading his field, and I was fascinated by the brain and that being, the frontier of the human body. And I was determined sort of to go down this path. And I progressed through med school, and I was heavily involved in brain cancer research and trying to find treatments that would move the needle on what's a pretty terrible prognosis where patients are given no longer than 15 months to live. And it was during my time at a research lab that we started working on a vaccine clinical trial with Duke University. It was a really promising immunotherapy vaccine, and we were running this trial and we were trying to find patients, and we ended up with 2 patients in all of Australia. And they came from a particular neurosurgeon who was associated with the lab and knew about the research that we were doing. But unfortunately, because we couldn't get more than 2 patients, this trial actually failed, and this potentially breakout treatment wasn't able to come to market. And for me, that was really perplexing. And I think looking at sort of what was out there, I was really perplexed that we were seeing patients in clinic who were willing to travel to Germany or Brazil to access these treatments, and they didn't know that there was a trial in their own backyard that they could have had access to. So it was out of this frustration and knowing that we were never going to move the needle on treatment for brain cancer if clinical trials simply kept failing because we relied on patients visiting the right clinician or having access to the right hospital and being told about these opportunities, that I founded HealthMatch. And the concept's really simple. It's about democratizing access to clinical trials. So no matter what a patient's background is, where they live, or which doctor they see, they can have the ability to find, match, and apply to these potentially life-saving treatments. And this could mean that your mom gains access to a new immunotherapy for breast cancer. A rural Australian is able to access the same opportunities as someone living in Melbourne next to Peter Mac. Or someone in the US without health insurance can, be able to access incredible levels of healthcare. When I was last part of Vogue Codes in 2020, we were in the midst of our 18 mil Series B. It was one of the largest health tech raises in Australia during the height of the pandemic. And the ever-changing environment and COVID presented significant challenges to all businesses at the time, but it also presented opportunities. And over the last 18 months, from the panel in November 2020 till today, HealthMatch has scaled from a team of 15 to over 50, from helping 60,000 patients to now over 1.1 million patients in Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And for these patients, we've now been able to offer over 3.5 million matches to trials. And for those who've chosen to apply, we've had 32,000 patients accepted into clinical trials on the platform across 250 condition areas. And it's something I'm incredibly proud of, these results, and the impact that the team has had on delivering the mission that HealthMatch set out on for patients. And I'm likewise delighted to have the opportunity today to share some of the experiences and lessons I've learnt from leading HealthMatch through COVID and how I think about scaling and leadership in the future. I distinctly remember being in New York in early February 2020 and noticing sort of the growing news of the outbreak, and essentially within 2 months, we were in this unprecedented lockdown, travel had completely halted, and hospital systems were becoming incredibly overwhelmed. And so non-essential activities like clinical trials were being abandoned. And at the time, our small and relatively new team was thrown into absolute chaos, and we had no clue of the impact COVID was going to have on clinical trials or how long this would last. And when asked to reflect back over the past 2 years on the biggest leadership lessons that I've learnt through scaling HealthMatch whilst navigating this pandemic, I think there are 3 key principles that stood out to me. The first is the importance of adaptability in a rapidly shifting environment. The second is leveraging first principles in decision making during uncertainty. And finally, building great teams, because this becomes even more vital when you're in a high pressure environment. One of the most important skills any leader can have in a startup environment is adaptability. Context changes rapidly in fast-moving, disruptive businesses, and your strategy and your execution has to be able to move with these rapid changes. And the best leaders synthesize information quickly, they're decisive, and it doesn't mean that you should have knee-jerk reactions in your leadership to every bit of incremental information, but if there's a reason for you to change your strategy and your execution, you shouldn't be wedded to an old plan. And I think there's a great quote that I've heard from some very smart managers, and I often feel that this is really relevant. So, strong opinions loosely held. So when the pandemic began, we were fortunate that adapting to work from home as a tech company was pretty straightforward. But how we were going to build a business, keep it alive and thriving, was another matter entirely. And we had to move quickly to do something. So when COVID severely disrupted clinical trials that we were working on, it presented us with the opportunity for HealthMatch to really rapidly pivot to help recruit and spread awareness around COVID trials in particular. And we saw the opportunity to become a universal source of information. So our engineering teams, quite literally over a weekend, spun up a COVID clinical trial tracker, and quite a bit of the industry and public and even some national news channels picked up this tracker as a way to keep informed about the research that was happening with COVID. We also saw the opportunity to offer our services for free to help fill these trials, and yes, we could have focused on profiteering, but we decided to approach the problem in a way that maximised HealthMatch's reputation and market. And it worked. It generated significant goodwill with pharmaceutical companies, many of which are our customers today. So being adaptable doesn't mean that you won't make mistakes when you change your strategy or execution plans, but it does mean that when you see the signs, you can move quickly to course correct and make the most of a changing environment. I'm also a big believer in the power of first principles, particularly when making decisions in times of great uncertainty. So HealthMatch operates in a complex and highly regulated space, which touches many stakeholders, and so often decisions and problems can become overwhelming quickly if they snowball. This isn't uncommon for many industries and companies across healthcare, fintech, and other verticals. So over the past 2 years, I found the most time I spend distilling complex information down to first principles and working with our values, the answer becomes simpler and clearer. When you spend time to develop your foundations, so your vision, your mission, and values as a company, you can then actively use these in decision making. This is key, especially if you want to empower your team to make decisions in environments which lack context and have significant ambiguity. We've had countless times where product or operational decisions have arisen where we needed to choose between either revenue, efficiency, or the patient experience. And when we use our first principle thinking and we put our values at the core of that decision making, the decision is simple regardless of the context. And if you're just starting a business, I think this is really essential. It's easy to put off and dismiss as not important, but distill what's important to you and your company, empower your team to act on it, and rely on it when you need to make decisions. We've never made a bad decision when we've used our values to make them at HealthMatch, but we've made plenty of bad decisions when we had to try and balance 50 competing priorities and ignored what was truly important to us as an organisation. So strong leadership to me is 10 times more important during uncertain times than when you're operating in a status quo environment. The best advice that I've ever received from founders that have built billion-dollar businesses is that the importance of building the right team and looking for the right qualities in the people you bring on board should never be underestimated. You know, startups are a really unique employment proposition. You know, they're high risk by nature, challenging work environments that don't suit everyone, and because of the speed at which we scale, someone that we hire as an individual contributor could be a manager very shortly and then operating a team of 10 plus individuals in less than 12 months. So you really need to be up for the challenge. And a rigorous hiring process is crucial to make sure that you're setting up your team for future success. And there are a few traits that I've learned to look for. The first is, are they a missionary or mercenary? Startups are tough, particularly in the early days. It's crucial to have people on board that have a strong affinity for what you're doing and alignment with your mission, because as things flux, you want team members that can stick it through in tough times. Secondly, I look for people that thrive with uncertainty and limited context. So no startup will ever give you the same amount of support as an established corporation. So does this person have a track record of thriving in ambiguity, and are they a self-starter? And then finally, how do they fit with values and culture? And in small teams, I think fit's incredibly important. This doesn't mean you don't hire for diversity, but I think that, that would be a big mistake, but it absolutely does mean that you need to ensure your team members are super aligned with the values you have as a company. So if you're just starting a new venture or you're on your way to starting one, the most important thing you can do as a leader is build a brilliant team and empower them to do great work. Teams make or break companies, and culture, and the culture that you cultivate and the example that you set as a leader and the people you bring on board are ultimately how you drive success, regardless of any technology you have or unfair advantage. So I hope some of these lessons and anecdotes I've shared with you have resonated. And whilst COVID was a challenge for many businesses, I think we'll see probably far more turmoil in early stage businesses from the current market environment and the impeding recession. And despite the bleak horizon, the same principles apply. The companies that best adapt to new environments and rapidly do so will be best placed for success. I wanted to share, Sequoia, the fabled US VC, they recently released a deck earlier this month on this very topic with a quote from a Formula One driver, Ayrton Senna. And it goes something like, you cannot overtake 15 cars in sunny weather, but you can when it's raining. So ultimately, bull or bear market, there are opportunities in both, and good leadership should position a company well in any condition. And, the best companies were built in the hardest of times. So thank you.
Manuri, thank you for that. Can we give her another round of applause? She's just... Because you were all here probably this morning, you probably didn't get to see the incredible piece Channel 7 did on Manuri this morning. But I'm so pleased that your story is being taken to so many more Australians, because I truly believe what you're doing at HealthMatch is extraordinary and, as you say, life-changing for people all over the world. So congratulations from us again. And thank you for coming back to Vogue Codes. It was wonderful on screen last time, but it's much better to have you in person.
It's really nice to be here in person and talking to everyone in person.
So we spoke a lot about you spoke a lot about leadership. Empathetic leadership is something a lot of companies are talking about. I'd love to know what does that mean to you?
I think for me, empathetic leadership is being able to sort of lead from the front and show your team that you're there with them in the trenches, as well as being able to relate to the problems that your team may be facing. So, whether it's people trying to balance work in a startup environment and life, or whether it's problems around scaling, it's kind of being there with your team, having open lines of communication and being approachable. At HealthMatch, it doesn't matter if you're the CTO or you're the graduate engineer, like we keep things incredibly approachable, and we've built a culture that means that team members can talk to managers across different sort of areas, and I think approachability to me is what empathetic leadership looks like.
You spoke a lot about first principles and values, which I love. Vogue had set out some very clear values in 2019, and I found they were incredibly helpful during COVID, and they do act as a bit of a North Star. Is that something that you learnt, or were you around a mentor who taught you, or is that all self-taught?
No,
the idea of sticking to your values?
I think definitely mentors. I think we had like a very defined mission at HealthMatch, right? And, I think from the get-go, it was like, how do we change medicine to be very much patient-centric? And that helped feed the values that we built at HealthMatch. And I had a mentor who really, when we spoke about hiring and building teams, was like, the way that I think about it is, values and mission is key. Finding people that align with your values and mission is key, because it means that regardless of whether you're going through a tough time or a good time, people are going to be super motivated to keep chugging through and working on what they're working on. So values, horsepower or experience, that was the other thing. And I tend to, pick horsepower over experience when looking at hiring. And this mentor really drove into me that in building a business, if you have like core principles and values, then when you're making tough decisions around balancing, like I mentioned, revenue or product decisions, it becomes really easy to pick the path that you take.
So you mentioned again alignment, which is something I think is essential to success. People have got to be aligned in the same goals or have the same interest for the same outcome to be achieved.
Yeah.
Do you have a way of interviewing people, or do you have certain questions that you ask everyone or present them with a problem to see what their response would be? How do you pick how they might align themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, I've pretty much done every culture interview at the end. I know it's not scalable. We're getting to 50 people, and eventually I won't be the one doing those interviews. But I think for me, testing alignment means motivation. Like, why are you joining a startup? Why are you joining HealthMatch? What do you want to be part of? Is there sort of that drive to build impact and solve a problem? And do you understand the problem that we're solving? So oftentimes I will kind of try and get someone to explain their motivation and what they want out of joining HealthMatch. And I feel like that gives away a lot around the alignment and whether they'd work in sort of the environment that we've created.
And just for a few people in the room, you've scaled very quickly. Have you scaled in Australia or America, or where are your people?
Yeah, so most of the teams in Australia, so product engineering, but we have some go-to-market in America. We only just launched into the US, so November last year. We did that virtually without sort of being able to travel, and hired team members on the ground. So we're in Australia, New Zealand, and the US. And I think as we keep scaling, we'll keep most of the team in Australia. It makes sense, as a tech company, really all we need is our go-to-market teams in the new markets. But it's exciting to be able to jump on a plane again and actually meet people that you've hired in different geographies.
That was going to be my next question. Have you met them yet?
Yeah.
Have you met everybody who works for you?
Earlier this year, it was nice to travel again.
So we heard Professor Green, who I have to say I absolutely loved. I mean, she's got the most smiley, fabulous face. If you wanted somebody in charge of being optimistic about getting a it's got to be her, right?
Yeah.
But we heard how difficult funding can be for R&D. Is that your experience? Could you tell us something about the funding process? You mentioned the clinical trial where you couldn't get enough people, so it doesn't go ahead. Yeah. Is it a very laborious process?
Yeah. So I guess there's funding for HealthMatch and then there's funding in clinical trials. And I think clinical trials, what's really surprising is that 80% of trials fail. And there's all this funding that goes into drug development. And, people are finding, the latest therapies using machine learning. And there's so much happening on that end. And then we kind of get to operating a clinical trial and trying to get a drug to market. And you get bottlenecked by these operational problems. So for pharmaceutical companies or biotechs, you put in a lot of investment to get these drugs up and running. You test them in labs, you see great results. And then if they just don't make it through because of barriers that exist, then you've lost all this investment. So, it discourages funding going into like early stage biotechs, and it makes it tough. So I think it's really important to solve these, like, they're quite outdated problems that exist because of the way the healthcare system's been set up. And I think if we can solve this, it'll make drug development cheaper, which means that medications will be more accessible for patients as well.
Now we've got some audience questions. What's your best piece of advice for pitching to investors?
Best piece of advice, I guess, is be really clear in what you want to achieve, and don't be sort of persuaded by investors in terms of like the feedback you get, because oftentimes you'll hear VCs or investors have different opinions on how you should build and scale a company. But I think it's really important to have your conviction around what you want to do and what you believe is going to be the way to scale your company the fastest, and stick to it. Because I think what's really interesting is that when times are tough or when markets change, people very quickly switch their opinions on how companies should be built and scaled. So I think sticking to your guns is really important.
Now, I promise this one isn't from your mum unless she is in the room, but would you ever go back to finish your degree in medicine?
Yeah.
Mum out there?
Yeah. I didn't know she got a ticket. No, I feel like, so I've been able to defer it for 4 years, and the dean of the med school's been really good because he actually worked in clinical trials. So maybe one day, but I find that like startups are just very exciting and it's a whole new world. So it would have to be a long time into the future if I ever did go back.
Well, Manuri, you're probably going to get an honorary doctorate anyway, so
yeah,
you probably won't
Mum
need
will be
to.
happy. I can tick that one off. So.
But congratulations again from all of us at Vogue and Optus, and thank you for being here today. You're like our superhero, and we wish you all the best with HealthMatch.
Thanks very much for having me.